session. We would like to thank first of all our colleagues from IFAD for the provided opportunity to organize this side event on the margins of Indigenous Peoples Week, which is taking place. And I would like to inform all participants around the world that this meeting has interpretation in English, French, and Spanish, so you can enjoy interpretation. And this year theme of the Indigenous Peoples Week is very timely, as we will focus on the value of indigenous food systems, and knowing what majority of people around the world face dramatic loss of human lives, and number of undernourished people is only growing. Many of our community members lose their job and currently lack basic social protection, and access to public services very limited. We could see it as well, but there are many kids, school children, who cannot return to the classrooms, and this is due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. Having said that, when our objective is today not to speak about challenges, but remain positive, looking for alternative ways of dealing with current crisis. And this is why UNESCO and the partner organizations, IFAD and FAO, we decided to organize a side event with an aim to create a space for a dialogue, sharing good practices, and reflect on the role of languages as a cross-cutting phenomena which transcends all spheres of our lives, including the agriculture and indigenous food systems. And we hope that this side event will help us to identify some new opportunities, amplify positive and hopeful stories for action, and within the context of International Decade of Indigenous Languages, which will be beginning next year. So let us start by recalling what the right to food is one of the fundamental human rights, which protects all human beings to live in dignity, free of hunger, food security, and malnutrition. And over the centuries, indigenous peoples have cultivated their land and territories, passing with traditional knowledge about the maintenance, preservation, restoration of the local ecosystems from one generation to another. And it was done obviously through the languages, mother tongue. And there are many connections between health, land, knowledge of plants, food, healing herbs, cosmology, mental, spiritual, cultural, and social well-being. And at the same time, when we looked at the poverty and language maps, and I would emphasize language maps, which are often used as a tools to design better policies and interventions, we will unfortunately observe that many areas with a large population living in poverty, facing hunger and water shortage on daily basis, are in the territories or nearby territories, which are as well so-called language hotspots. Those language hotspots are concentrated in the regions of the world having the highest level of linguistic diversity and the highest level of communities facing multiple challenges. And very often we observe as well that these are the least studied and documented languages. This obviously leads to a conclusion that dealing with current challenges like COVID-19, we have to adopt more holistic approach. And this session is concentrated on issues related to indigenous food systems, but I would like maybe to emphasize a few elements where we come from as an organization, which actually is in charge of International Decade, indigenous languages. But there are many studies which emphasize that the realization of indigenous people's rights to food depends not only on the access to and control over the natural resources and land, but I would say more on food sovereignty and sustainability. And there are many ways how the food sovereignty and sustainability can be achieved. But in the context of current crisis, we believe that access to public services, including those technology-based services provided in local languages, which are understood by the population, become an increasingly important aspect. And many studies as well show and provide solid arguments that digital technology improves the livelihoods of farmers through increased agricultural productivity, enhanced access to information for community-supported agriculture, through different tools, resources, services, such as geographic information systems, electronic commerce, computer-based control devices, and many other tools. But we observe as well that smart mobile applications in particular are widely used by the farmers for social communication, health emergencies, management of crops, contracting experts on different agricultural advices and other aspects. So this is why it is important from one side to make sure that new technological solutions are developed in accessible and indigenous languages a friendly manner. And from another side, but it would be more efforts put it to increase farmers' confidence and skills in technology, as well as encouraging improvements in network connectivity and power supply. And with this introductory statement, I would like to invite all participants to share your views who are present here as speakers, and those who are participating in participants' position, not to hesitate to share with us your questions in the chat what we have. And without much waiting, I would like to invite one of our colleagues, the first speaker, Bipin Kumar Jojo from India, who is professor from Center for Social Justice and Governance, School of Social Work, Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai, who is associated with many multiple community outreach initiatives and community-based civil society organizations in India. And he's invited to this panel as well because his research interests cover a very large area of issues related to tribe governance, land, forest, tribal policies, education, migration issues, and obviously social inclusion of indigenous communities. So I invite Professor Bipin Kumar Jojo to switch on his microphone and to deliver his intervention on this important theme.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair, Madam Emargarda, and IFAD team to organize this event and giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts and ideas on indigenous language and food. Let me take you through briefly about the indigenous communities in India. So there are about 700 indigenous communities living in India with a population of about 100 million, more than 100 million, who have been recognized as or categorized as scheduled tribes by the government of India. They all have been divided, or they all belong to different racial and linguistic groups. And we have about, as per the UNESCO report, we have 1,635 languages, and 197 languages are vulnerable as per the UNESCO study. Out of all these languages, we have three scripts. Three languages have got scripts. 2 languages have been included as part of the 8th schedule of our Indian Constitution, which means it has been officially recognized to be used as part of the education or other usages. And there are many more languages which have been proposed by the regional government to be included in the 8th schedule of the languages so that they can be used officially. The indigenous people in India have been located into different ecosystems, different topography. They belong to different topography, different climatic condition. They have different diversity. All of them are closely connected or associated with nature. Their food system revolves around land, forest, water. So the food, culture, and celebration, songs, stories, games, sports, all these things are very much associated with the nature. What I mentioned, forest, land, and water. So in this kind of context, we see that India is a country with a large ethnic community or indigenous people. And it has immense wealth due to which it is rich in its biodiversity. I like to use some data from UNESCO again, which has been conducted in India. And as per this UNESCO document, there are about 45 species of wild plants, out of which 9,500 species are ethnobotanically important species. Of these 45,000 species, 7,500 species are used for medical or medicinal purposes by the indigenous people. About 3,900 plant species are used by indigenous peoples as food. Okay, either be it root or tubers or leafy vegetables or bulbs or flowers or species of fruits or fiber. Okay, so there are the many species, many plants which are used in their daily life as part of the food, medicine, and so on and so forth. In addition to this, in the Indian subcontinent, Indian subcontinent is one of the 12 mega centers of biodiversity in the world, representing 2 of the 18 hotspots of biological diversity in India. Looking at all these natural resources, be it plants, be it other species, the indigenous people's life has revolved around the produces from the forest. If I give an example, say for example, mushroom. Now we all know that mushroom is one of the very proteinful food, and there is the indigenous people know the how to choose or how to collect wild mushroom from the forest. That now, of course, we see that there is cultivation of mushroom, but there are many mushrooms which are collected from the forest which are wild. There are also many kind of which usually called as red ants. They are all found in the forest and they are used very much part of the food. But today what has happened that with the kind of modernization, with the kind of commercialization, now that these mushrooms have been in the market economy. So that the people who were eating as part of the regular food in a particular season, now they do not like to eat, rather they want to sell it so that they can get some money. Okay, so one of our panelists, my friend from India, Neelam's study mentioned that during the time of Indian independence, each region in the state of Chhattisgarh, that is one of the states in central India, or then part of the Madhya Pradesh, cultivated 19,000 rice varieties, 19,000 rice varieties in particular region, which were quite suitable to the soil, climatic, and other variations in that region. And also, his research finds that 15 to 20 varieties of rice in an average in each single village in each given region. Okay, so all this rice, which were part of the indigenous seeds, which were very acclimatized to the local reality, local climatic conditions, and local soil. And so the food system, which was based on this biodiversity, which was built on symbiotic relationship between nature and the indigenous people. We can see many examples which we had and we still have. That is called grain bank. The grain bank kept many of these paddies, seeds of paddy, and the villagers in the community, people could borrow, people could take to sow this paddy or rice as and when they require, and they can return it so that it circles and it circulates within the community, and the traditional seeds could be preserved. Similarly, it is not only the food, but along with this food system, there are many social institutions were associated which preserve the community bonding and the community culture and traditions, like collectivization of labor. Okay, the collectivization of labor, which promoted the community bonding, self-reliance, interdependent, and occasionally celebrations and supporting each other at every events of life in the family. So if we look at the genetic diversity and crop diversity was less in cash crops, more in essential crops such as rice, pulses, millet, etc., which they were suitable to the land pattern and climatic condition, as I mentioned. However, with the increase to increase the productivity and to go with the flow of the market economy, this crop diversity has got into these genetically modified seeds and use of pesticides, which has affected the biodiversity. So with this kind of use of pesticide and fertilizers, many of the species which are found in the agriculture field where have been disappearing. So with this kind of situation, I like to take it 2 points with reference to India. One is the kind of theoretical historical view of isolation, integration, and assimilation emanating from the nation state as part of the so-called development or modernization project or agenda. As part of this agenda, development has taken the path of appropriating the natural resources like land, forest, water to the fullest for the national development and deny the access to the indigenous people. And so we can see the large displacement because of the industries, dams, and other mining activities. And this also has changed the lifestyles in the name of development, be it food, housing pattern, remedies for the diseases, etc. And so if you look at the data from the government, the expert committee data of tribal health says that among the tribal people, it has been found that their intake of foodstuff has reduced from the recommended daily allowances. Okay, similarly, the UNICEF also mentioned, UNICEF data also mentioned that there are about 4.7 million tribal children of India who suffer from chronic nutrition deprivation. And similarly, 40% of under 5 children in India are stunted. 16% of them are severely stunted. Okay, so poverty also, if you look at the larger percentage of indigenous people, or we call it tribes or Adivasi people, are still living with poverty. And so this kind of situation, with this kind of isolation to integration and assimilation process, which was the approach adopted after the independence in India, it is often perceived that when the Adivasis or indigenous people are in isolation, they enjoyed the freedom, they enjoyed the autonomy of their environment or their biodiversity, whether their own life. The moment they got into the process of assimilation or integration, they had to negotiate, they have to get into adaptation process. In that process, their autonomy or freedom got lost, and they got assimilated, or they got adapted to the larger dominant systems. So in this kind of situation, there is point of language and food system. Language, as we know, is a very important point or important aspect to preserve and transfer the knowledge on the food system. Okay, language is essential in nutrition biodiversity in many respects too. The years of engagement with ecosystem have resulted in very unique nomenclature among the indigenous peoples. So the language attached against each of the species has different cultural significance. It used different language, different words. So Nilam's research also shows that trend of decreasing biodiversity in food and agriculture in the region where the food of indigenous language is weak. So development, displacement, urbanization, migration, education in languages are powerful or majority, and demeaning the mother tongue of indigenous children and changing lifestyle, be it in assimilation or integration, the language and culture is disappearing. Songs of folk stories or folk laws are disappearing. So in this kind of situation, my second point I like to draw, the last point, is how language is an epistemology for the indigenous people, which needs important attention. With the kind of modernization, the kind of project of modernization, there has been inferiorization of knowledges and the rejection of epistemologies of indigenous people. So even if when we go back to the history, since the 18th century, there has been a dominant framework of West or the European dominant epistemology for the language, for the knowledge building processes. And thus it is important to recognize that most knowledge about the indigenous people that pervades academia and other spaces that were marked as scientific and thus reliable. Well, these were acts of colonization. They were an outsider's gaze performed by Europeans or upper caste in Indian context, who perceived themselves as located in the position that count as universal. And these groups produce such knowledge only to serve and inform their own societies. Either it is Western European societies or caste Indian societies, respectively. Therefore, the four fundamental issues in the indigenous knowledge system is very critical to theorize from the indigenous perspective. The way of colonization, because we have inherited colonization. After independence, we feel that we have been free from colonization. However, one of our indigenous scholars said that the indigenous people in India have been going through the waves of colonization. So we need to reconceptualize the colonization. The framing of modernity, we have to revisit that. Then problematization of development and governance, I think we need to theorize. Then problematics of epistemology in knowledge building process. So friends, we have to create our narratives about our food, about our knowledge, about our language. And so this process has already began around the world, be it Canada.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I'll stop here and say that let us use our language to produce our knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. This is really great intervention. I'm very sorry, but I have to interrupt such an interesting statement. And I would like to invite now Mr. Carlos de la Torre Postigo, who is our expert from Peru. And he has more than 20 years of experience in promoting sustainable development in communities of Southern and Central Peru and in neighboring countries of Bolivia and Ecuador. And he's been promoting technological change and adapted to local communities. So I invite him to switch on his microphone. I know what he would like to share with us, his PowerPoint presentation. And if you need an interpretation, please switch to interpretation as well, all participants who are here present. So Mr. Carlos, the floor is yours.
Querido Carlos, ¿puede ver la notificación para hacer un mute? ¿Puede aceptarla, por favor? Porque no lo escuchamos. Podemos ver su presentación, pero no podemos escucharlo.
Ahora sí.
Hola.
Ahora sí lo escuchamos. Adelante.
Ya, perdón. Ya, tengo que ponerle, perdón, en pantalla grande, ¿no? ¿Está is this in full screen? Yeah,
sí, ahora
okay.
sí. Sí, gracias. Adelante.
Ya, so let me speak in Spanish. Buenos días con todos. Esta presentación titula Conceptos nativos, sistemas alimenticios, resistencia frente a la pandemia en comunidades andinas. Tiene 4 partes: la población, conceptos importantes en la lengua quechua, sistemas alimentarios en el Perú y estrategias para reforzar el sistema alimentario campesino y enfrentar la pandemia. Para iniciar, quiero que sepan que Perú está ubicado en la mitad de Sudamérica, en la costa del Pacífico. Y según el último censo, tiene 32 millones de habitantes. De estos, de ese total, la población nativa, indígena, originaria, es un 26% aproximado según el censo. La población mestiza es un 60%, la población blanca 6% y la afroperuana 4% y otros no considerados, ¿no? En este punto quiero decirles que la población originaria del 26% está subestimada, porque es muy difícil preguntar quiénes son o quiénes no son originarios o indígenas. Mucha gente oculta decirlo por temor al castigo social. Es una vergüenza ser indígena en el Perú todavía hoy día. Entonces, este 60%, posiblemente un 50% es también originario. ¿Por qué? Porque ya son 100 años de que los nativos que viven en las comunidades rurales vienen migrando a las ciudades. Mi abuela vino el año 1910, también es parte de ese movimiento. En el sentido de las lenguas, los estudios dicen que hay 55 pueblos originarios que hablan 44 idiomas nativos. Cuatro de estos idiomas se ubican en las zonas altas del Perú y 44 en la zona baja, en la selva. El idioma más hablado es el quechua, que también se llama runasimi. Se estima que por lo menos habría 4 millones de personas que lo hablan, pero yo creo que es el doble o mucho más. Bueno, entonces quiero mostrarles unos conceptos de la lengua nativa que tienen relación con el tema de la relación interpersonal. Quiero argumentar que en la cultura nuestra era bastante importante las relaciones entre personas y entre entidades que eran diferentes. Entonces, de partida, los antiguos peruanos reconocen la diferencia entre los lados izquierdo y derecho dentro de un mismo ser humano. Yoke izquierda, paña derecha. Esto pueden verlo acá en el siguiente gráfico. Un cerámico del siglo VIII, ven un ojo de un color y otro ojo de otro color. Está indicando que en nuestro interior hay dos energías, una de izquierda y una de derecha. Pero hay una unidad. Entonces, es importante esta diferencia. Este es un collar de la cultura moche en la costa peruana, donde hay la mitad es de plata y la otra mitad es de oro, izquierda, plata y oro derecha. También está mostrando las dos partes de una unidad. Ya, ese es el principio yoke paña. Luego también hay un concepto semejante que es el warmikari. Warmikari es mujer, hombre o masculino, femenino. Aquí ven un grabado del siglo XVI, muestra al rey Inca y su esposa están compartiendo una ceremonia en una condición de igualdad de género. Llevado esto a un nivel macro, a nivel político, organizativo, se creó un estado, una gran alianza que tenía 4 regiones llamadas Tahuantinsuyo. Esto viene del verbo Tahuantin, que significa 4 regiones que actúan en conjunto a pesar de que son diferentes. Aquí hay Antisuyo, en la zona caliente, la selva, al norte, al sur está el Kuntisuyo, la zona caliente de volcanes, al lado izquierdo Chinsaysuyo, es la zona más de mejores cultivos, la zona que da al mar Pacífico, y el Collasuyo, la zona alta de las montañas. Las 4 regiones forman la unidad del Tahuantinsuyo. Y también es muy importante el concepto de Tupay. El concepto de Tupay significa que hay 2 entidades que no se conocen y que se encuentran por primera vez. Y pueden dialogar, pueden concertar, pueden luchar, hasta pueden matarse uno a otro. En este grabado de un palacio inca, ustedes ven 2 serpientes de igual dimensión. No sabemos cuál es el género, pero se están mirando, pero no sabemos si están conversando, si están dialogando, si están llegando a acuerdos, pues están a punto de matarse. Pero esto creo que es un gran paradigma en la cultura inca del siglo XIV y XVI, de que los problemas se deben enfrentar directamente, de manera serena, cara a cara. O sea, enfrentar lo desconocido de esta manera. Es un principio, creo, principal en esta cultura, que todavía está vigente. Entonces, estos conceptos, ¿por qué los digo? Porque van a ser útiles hoy día en el entorno de pandemia y de cambio climático. Aquí hay también un tupay, o sea, un choque entre dos fuerzas distintas, entre el mundo de los hermanos no humanos, acá una alpaca, y el mundo de los humanos. Aquí está el rey inca y sus nobles y su esposa están dialogando con una alpaca en una ceremonia. Eso muestra que en las culturas nuestras había gran respeto por los seres que eran no humanos. Hoy día se está retomando en el planeta ese respeto. Bueno, pasando rápidamente al tema de sistemas alimentarios en el Perú actual, estoy proponiendo que hay 3 sistemas alimentarios que conviven y que tienen relaciones entre ellos, pero que tienen autonomía relativa unos de otros. Aquí no estoy hablando de la agricultura de exportación, es un tema aparte. Estoy hablando de la agricultura y de la industria que alimenta a la población interna. Entonces, el sistema 1 es la gran agroindustria en gran escala, que son importaciones de productos, trigo, soya, para hacer harinas, para el pan y para el aceite, y para la producción de aves de corral. Son productos masivos. Es un negocio manejado por grandes empresas, extranjeras y nacionales. Segundo sistema, la producción agraria en gran escala también para abastecer a los mercados de las grandes ciudades internas del Perú. Aquí, ¿qué productos son? El arroz, la leche de vacuno, la carne de vacuno, la papa híbrida, el maíz, frutas, hortalizas, carne de cuy, quinoa y otros, café. Esta es producción agrícola en gran escala con una visión comercial que abastece los mercados internos. Y un sistema 3 es la producción agraria en pequeña escala para el consumo de las comunidades rurales y para la venta en mercados locales. Aquí está el maíz, las papas nativas, la quinoa, la carne de ovinos, los vacunos y alpacas y hortalizas. La población nativa, que se llama indígena, y que vive en comunidades andinas, en Perú tenemos 6.600 comunidades andinas registradas en el año 2017. Quiero decir que en cada censo de población las comunidades no desaparecen, ¿no? Que va aumentando cada vez más. Bueno, las comunidades integran este sistema 3, producen alimentos para sí mismos y los excedentes que tienen los venden para conseguir dinero para comprar productos de la ciudad, pero su objetivo no es la ganancia y por lo tanto no tiene mucho interés en calcular costos ni en calcular márgenes de rentabilidad. Su interés es alimentarse, proteger a sus familias y, por supuesto, ganar algún dinero. Bueno, entonces vamos a ver entonces que en el siguiente punto cómo las estrategias del Estado peruano y de los organismos no gubernamentales han trabajado ya casi unos 30 años en reforzar el sistema 3, o sea, reforzar a las comunidades campesinas y a su producción campesina. Acá hay un ejemplo de un capacitador campesino que llamamos Camayo, que está atendiendo a una alpaca, que es un ganado que vive en alturas arriba de 4.000 metros. Estoy yendo un poco rápido, disculpen. Aquí hay una pareja de campesinos capacitadores, también llamados Camayo, la esposa y el esposo, o sea, es el principio del Cariwarmi, esposo y esposa que están trabajando en su ganado propio y enseñando, capacitando a otros agricultores y resolviendo problemas pecuarios. Esto se hizo con la organización ITDG en la zona de Perú, Cusco, donde yo trabajé como más de 20 años. Acá hay otra zona donde también se ve a una pareja de esposos, Cariwarmi, que están defendiéndose de la pandemia. Aquí están ellos, estos señores han generado un producto que se llama un tónico, que se elabora con un conjunto de 8 o 10 plantas y para evitar que el virus de COVID-19 afecte, ¿no? al corazón, a la respiración. Estas fotos son muy recientes, son de hace un mes nomás. Esta es otra pareja también, Cariwarmi, que están elaborando un insecticida con cerca de 11 plantas naturales. ¿Para qué? Para proteger las semillas, para proteger los cultivos que ellos tienen para su alimentación. Con esto, ¿qué están haciendo? Están evitando comprar los insumos químicos que son costosos y que también implicarían ir a la ciudad, y lo cual tiene el riesgo de contraer la enfermedad del virus. Entonces, ¿qué quiero decir? Los agricultores comuneros se están defendiendo de esta manera, están protegiendo su alimentación, usando su biodiversidad. Aquí está la señora Gregoria Genara, que también mostrando su gran diversidad de maíz. Ella es sanadora, o sea, también es partera, y está muy contenta de compartir con los visitantes su conocimiento, ¿no? Entonces, hay estrategias para proteger a las familias comuneras, y esto, en esta estrategia es muy importante la lengua. Ellos hablan el idioma rural-símil 100%. Por supuesto, cuando viene un forastero, hablan castellano con él, ¿no? Pero prefieren hablar su lengua nativa. Entonces, los conocimientos se transmiten en la lengua nativa. Y eso es importante valorarlo. En el Perú hay una tradición fuerte de desprecio por lo nuestro, y mucha gente se avergüenza de hablar lo poco que sabe de la lengua nativa. Un poquito más. Esta lámina es ya la final, donde un grupo de comuneros, que están mujeres, y los patronos al otro lado están diciendo, saludando, y dicen, Tupananchis Kama, Hueque Panacuna, dice, hasta el próximo encuentro, hermanos y hermanas. No sé cuánto tiempo he tomado, creo que he ido muy rápido, pero this is the end. Do I have some minutes still? Garda?
Thank you very much, Carlos, for keeping on time. And without any delay, I would like to invite Mr. Nilan Kerketa, a researcher from Center for Political Studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University in India, who belongs to one of the tribal communities in India. And his research results and interest around indigenous peoples and climate change, food and agricultural sustainability, and political ecology. So I invite Mr. Kerketa.
Hello, can you hear me? Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. The previous talks have actually really been insightful. I think I'm going to add very little to that discussion. The issue that we are dealing today are of very crucial importance and of immediate urgency. I must thank the entire team from UNESCO, IFAD, and FAO for making this discussion happen today, and for giving me this opportunity to participate in the effort to create a more sustainable planet Earth through indigenous collaboration. Indigenous people have excelled in sustainable agricultural system, especially with respect to endowing their diversified landscape with enormous crop diversity, and mostly in hostile and unfriendly terrain. At the time of speeding loss of genetic diversity and escalating ecological crisis, the indigenous peoples can contribute to environmental sustainability, along with their social and economic development. In this regard, digital capacity building among indigenous peoples can have very significant impact on their capacity to reproduce knowledge and nature, and also a truly sustainable society. The digital empowerment has resulted in many cases in enhanced capacity of indigenous people for more food production and in better and sustainable ways. For instance, indigenous people have the ingenuity of perceiving nature and weather pattern changes and adapt accordingly. But the pace of climate change sometimes outpaces their capacity to adapt to sudden environmental changes. This digital capacity enhancement in indigenous language will help them build a more resilient community and a more resilient agriculture system, especially in the context of climate change. Most of the indigenous population today are settled agriculturalists. Therefore, the proper use of ITC, digital technology, will also result in wider knowledge of market information for their produces. This will help in getting rid of middlemen and procuring wider consumer information, retailing their products directly to consumers instead of wholesaling, resulting in more and better price procurement. This is an urgent task to do, lest tomorrow it falls in the hands of third parties, especially the global e-commerce retail giants. This will also be a very effective tool to deliver indigenous food to indigenous people migrated to non-indigenous territories for various purposes. This will, as a result, reconnect them to their food, culture, and identity. In this very context, I would like to mention the initiative taken by a few of us here in India, indigenous people of Central India. We formed COPA, Cooperative of Adivasis, Adivasi meaning Hindi term for indigenous people, that includes both indigenous farmers and some indigenous researchers. Under this, we help farmers by making the proper use of ITC for better market accessibility and ultimately resulting in better price procurement. This twin strategy of increasing capacity of sustainable agriculture production and its distribution by using ITC, but specifically in their own indigenous languages, will not only create more livelihood and employment for indigenous youth at the time of falling employment opportunities globally, but also without any doubt will revitalize culture and language among indigenous youth, while also bringing them back to the soil who are otherwise at stake of losing their language, culture, identity, and indigeneity. We must also remember, however, while introducing indigenous people to market, that present market system for indigenous population is not just something new, but generally it is very hostile and competitive. During the time of increasing indigenous migration to non-indigenous territories, thus, ITC will not just be helpful in preserving the language, but also revitalizing it through documentation, propagation, advocacy, and impacting policies, both national and global. One thing that we need to be careful is the fact that indigenous people are new to the technology, and this will take time for them, both to access its use and incorporate them into their system. However, any technological advancement won't be complement to increasing their capacity to remain indigenous, protect their autonomy, identity, and communities. We as indigenous people need to be ever more careful in not getting into the paradigm of endless production and moving towards individualistic society. This pandemic, COVID-19, has very obviously revealed the vulnerability of present market model of endless production, limitless growth paradigm, and greed-based economy. Instead, we must gear towards something very, very need-based and very resilient food system. The ITC cannot also be imagined or enacted in a political or economic vacuum. The digital technology has unquestionably helped us to forge global solidarity and has enhanced our ability to mobilize external solidarity or international solidarity for the use of national and international legal instruments among indigenous people, among ourselves, especially to reclaim our rights over our resources and territories. The digital platform can be of great help to assert this sustainability and also sustainability of our food system. It will help us decolonize our food system from the modern agriculture system, and so that we can continue to produce sustainable and cultural food. Erosion of welfare states also globally has further decreased the capacity of nation state to take affirmative action for indigenous communities of their territories in this regard, especially at this crucial time of speeding loss of both biodiversity and language. Many policies meagerly reflect their crucial needs. Additionally, to make the case yet graver, we are also witnessing the growing fascist nature of various nations globally and the accompanying nationalistic agenda of homogenization of culture, language, and its people. This technological advancement, if carefully applied, I believe will be a tool of resistance and revitalization against attempts of cultural genocide, just as ITC has forged and revitalized international solidarity of indigenous people. We must also not forget that the indigenous struggle for equity, participation, dignity, autonomy, rights, and recognition is intractably linked to capabilities of indigenous people to use technology, and specifically digital technology, for community good. Technological advancement is inevitable and perhaps necessary. Indigenous ethics can push technology in a new direction, away from the toys of the rich towards the necessity of the poor. However, a central moral challenge for us is to prevent technologies from eroding the foundation of ethics on which our indigenous system rests. Finally, we are also witnessing escalating ecological crisis, and the world is unable to summon up a worthy response to the crisis. And at this very crucial moment, when we needed a truly global cooperation for resolving all pervasive global ecological crisis, we seem to all drift apart from each other and shrink back to our nationalistic corner. This indigenous system, including food system, has that potential to address the crisis. And through its cosmovision, will give us a direction for truly global cooperation. However, this requires more robust, nuanced, and appropriate inclusion and framing of indigenous issues in future, like the very major issue of digital inclusion by the indigenous people and also of the indigenous people. For this, I conclude my case by saying that the rest of the world for this requires to acknowledge and include diverse form of being and knowing in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And it's indeed, we would like to speak much more longer about digital inclusion and use of technologies, but the time is running, and I would like to invite now my UN colleagues to actually share more with us about creating synergies and partnerships. We have big plans in front of us, and I have a pleasure to invite my colleagues, Jon Fernandez de la Riva from FAO, and his colleague Maria Laos Telazo to share their views, and especially what we've been having already for some time, discussions about working together on the organization of International Decade of Indigenous Languages, and obviously establishing links with a UN Decade of Nutrition as well. So I give you the floor, Jon, and then we'll move on to Antonella afterwards.
Ingarda, thank you so much. Good afternoon to everyone, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Our sincere thanks to IFAD and to UNESCO for including us in this side event. And let me say that it's a great pleasure to be in the same slot with Antonella Cordone. We've been in many events together, so it's a great pleasure once again to share the panel. Allow me to introduce Maria Costa Lasso. Many of you know her. She has been the focal point on indigenous peoples for several years in the region in Panama, based in Panama, and she's been doing a lot of work. So Maria Costa is the focal person on collective rights of indigenous peoples. She's handling the task force on collective rights, and she's the focal person on the decade of indigenous languages. So over to you, Maria, and then I will chip in.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Okay. Okay, so this is the presentation on languages and traditional knowledge and the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems. I will start with talking a little bit about the holistic approach to food systems that indigenous peoples have. Research shows that there are three interlinked pillars related to food systems and indigenous peoples. One is health and nutrition. One is natural resources and biodiversity. And the third is language and culture. And this is this way because indigenous food systems are based on traditional knowledge and an holistic and not anthropocentric way of seeing life, including social, economical, spiritual elements, as well as governance, systems, and territorial management. That made indigenous people's knowledge of key importance in the context of climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and food systems sustainability. There is a lot to learn from indigenous peoples. So indigenous peoples' enriched vocabularies are a lot of importance for natural environment. This said, all these pillars are supported by languages. The names they give to plants, to herbs, to systems, including governance systems, are pillars of traditional knowledge. And also the way they communicate from generation to generation, and how the elders and the youngs work together to pass this traditional knowledge regarding food systems and regarding traditional governance. So we can see this importance also in the numbers. Out of 6,700 languages spoken in the world, 4,000 are indigenous. And also we can see how the relationship with biodiversity is so important in relation to languages. We found more than 3,000 languages in 35 biodiversity hotspots, and more than 2,000 are from individual regions. So the important thing is that research shows that when indigenous peoples start forgetting or not using their languages, the practices that support traditional governance, territorial management, and food systems start to vanish or to disappear. So the sustainability of indigenous peoples' territorial management and food systems are very close to languages and are very close to culture. Preserve and promote these practices is one of our goals with the Global Hub on the Indigenous Food Systems that my colleague John will present now.
Thank you, Maria. And concerned with the time, let us move straight to the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems. I think in the slide before, Maria, if you can just go 1 second before, I think it's connected to some of the points that the previous panelists were talking, the importance of language, particularly when referring to edibles and plants. Here's an example from Meghalaya, and then we see the number of foods that have a name and denomination in Kashi, and yet we are trying to understand what is the scientific name for many of those, and certainly what is the English name. So there's a major realm of knowledge that is within indigenous peoples that is not captured right now by what we sometimes call the formal science. Indigenous people science has been generated over hundreds of years through observation, through testing, through adaptation, and therefore it's very important to place that knowledge at the center of many of the policy debates. Next slide, please. And this is exactly why in 2020 we started, the next one, Maria. This is why in 2020 we started the Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems, to create a knowledge platform that brings together indigenous peoples organizations, UN system, research centers, everyone that is working collectively and in the ground on generating evidence about the uniqueness of indigenous peoples' food systems and how it is rooted in traditional knowledge. The Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems was endorsed by the member countries last year in September 2020 at the Technical Committee on Agriculture. Many indigenous peoples' proposals and points of discussion that are presented at this Technical Committee on Agriculture. More important is not the endorsement of countries, but it was the fact that there was no opposition by the member countries attending the discussion in the need to create this Global Hub on Indigenous Peoples' Food Systems. 18 members, and is based on partnerships, and collaboration with research centers and different organizations that are working today in advancing with indigenous peoples the evidence gathering about the centrality of the indigenous food systems. In the next slide, I will be talking about, Maria, allow me to pass the next slide, please. Okay. In this slide, let me share with you what is the objective of the Global Hub, which is to inform the global debate on sustainable food systems, of course, with a particular attention to the 2021 UN Food Systems Summit, but very importantly, within the decade of action on nutrition, the UN Decade of Restoration, the UN Decade of Indigenous Languages that Ingarda talked about, and of course, the Paris Agreement and the COPs that are essential to inform climate change within the 2030 agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals. The program of work of the Global Hub has 4 main pillars: a knowledge builders platform, an online database of specific publications, technical advice that is being provided to different organizations, governments, and institutions. And then very important, the creation of synergies, particularly about the research that different research centers and universities are conducted on indigenous people's food systems. In the next slide, please, Maria. Now, the first task of the Global Hub was to draft a white paper on indigenous people's food systems, a WIPALA paper, to complement the current conceptual framework that is being proposed by the scientific group to the UN Food Systems Summit. This is being done in a collective way with several indigenous organizations across the world, and now is being shared with the 7 sociocultural regions to ensure that indigenous peoples have the opportunity to provide their comments and make sure that it fully captures the richness and variety and diversity of indigenous peoples across the world. The white paper makes recommendations to the 5 action tracks that are informing the process of the UN Food Systems Summit. It presents elements of characterization of indigenous people's food systems, but it also gathers evidence on how culture, languages, cosmogony informs the sustainability of indigenous people's food systems. It introduces the differences between food generation and food production, and the difference between having a biocentric approach towards food versus an anthropocentric one. It challenges the current food systems concept used as a reference in most of the global discussions, and it provides facts on the sustainability of indigenous people's food systems from across the world to inform the path towards more sustainable food systems worldwide. Somehow, we are all trying to come up with sustainable food systems across the world when indigenous peoples, in many instances, have been practicing this for hundreds of years. Let us learn from them first. Let us go to the next slide, please, Maria. And with this, I think Maria and I, we would like to thank you for the use of the word. And of course, we want to listen to Antonella and to the rest of panelists. Thank you so much, Ingarda. Thank you so much, UNESCO. Thank you so much, IFAD. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Jon and our Maria as well, for this very, I would say, encouraging and promising Global Hub. And we are very proud to be part of this. And I would like to invite now Antonella Cordone, who is a senior technical specialist in nutrition and social inclusion at IFAD. And I would like just to thank once again IFAD for hosting this event together with us. And I would like as well particularly thank the team behind the scenes, actually, which helped us to put together such a great panel and interpreters for interpretation. So Antonella, please go ahead. It's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Edgarda, and thank you to all. And this is the strength of partnership. You know, what is being shown today as part of the same UN family, but also in alliance with indigenous peoples. I will really try to be brief, and needless to say how happy I am today to be part of this discussion with both my heads, the expert on nutrition, and also in my 15 years on engagement with indigenous peoples at IFAD. Now, all the panelists before me have very well and eloquently said about the connection between languages, territories, and resources, and vice versa. The languages are shaped by the land and the resources where the people live. Now, let's think about languages, and let's think about food and how it represents the identity of the people. I mean, I shouldn't say it as an Italian, but just to give the example, know that it's really part of the identity of a people, and there is an interconnection there. And the key, I also wish to highlight the key role that languages play in food systems, in how they define the species, the foods, the dishes, the practices, the knowledge, that it is transmitted orally from generation to generation in most cases. Now, with my predecessor, who was speaking from FAO, was saying how when a language disappears, what happens to the practice. But I also wish to say the contrary. When a practice disappears, there are no words to express that practice anymore. So we see how they are interconnected. And languages is one of the means that indigenous peoples and people in general have to value and view their system. And Carlos, for instance, has shown us the power of images, which is another important language that indigenous peoples use to transfer their cosmogony, which is holistic, where there is no sectorial divide between land, between food, between environment, between what is up on the surface of land and what is down and the spiritual world. So this is very important to put at the center, particularly for us who work with indigenous peoples and particularly in development projects and programs. Now, let me give you an example on shifting cultivation. One of the practices that it's still with many indigenous peoples communities, and this is a livelihood system, is not simply a production system. And if we imagine that in shifting cultivation, more than 100 species are grown in small plots of land, and when governments are pushing those communities to move to permanent agriculture, and often with few species which are provided as inputs by the governments, we run a high risk in food and nutrition insecurity for the people and for the livelihood systems, which are also social, where there is a reciprocity, where the plots are divided and are assigned every year in a collective governance system. And when these the shifting cultivation is banned in countries, and agroecological systems are not there to support the transition, then we'll see that there is a loss of knowledge, a loss of community bond, a loss of species, and a loss of the knowledge and the words that names the species that are produced through these systems. Now, I think and I see that the connecting ring in the chain are the youth. Languages tend to disappear also because young people often are obliged to migrate from their communities because there are very few opportunities for them, be it for studying abroad or be it for work. And sometimes also because parents don't want their children to continue to be discriminated against. So they don't want them to speak the language. And Carlos was telling this. No, there are many people who do not self-identify as indigenous because they don't want to be discriminated against. And then one of our speakers also mentioned digitalization, and it is a challenge, but it is also an opportunity. And it was shown by the cooperative of the Adivasi farmers, by Nilam, how this can be an economic opportunity, but also an opportunity to record the languages and the knowledge and the practices that indigenous peoples are rich of. And I believe that we need to invest more in the intergenerational approach and to support the transfer of knowledge and the transfer of languages from generation to generation, but not only something that needs to be done at family level and at community level. This is something that needs to be institutionalized through education, at the local and at the national level, and where the double curriculum of indigenous children and youth can be valued. And I believe that we need to link the dots and strengthen the partnerships and alliances at the global, at the country level, with the instruments that are already in place, and there are many, and also those that will emerge, for instance, from the processes leading to the Food Systems Summit. Now, let me quickly give some figures on nutrition, on malnutrition. 690 million people are undernourished in the world. 2 billion people experience some level of food insecurity. 144 million children aged under 5 years are stunted. And we also heard it from India. 47 million children under 5 are wasted. 38 million children under 5 are overweight. And the COVID-19 pandemic may add many more. And it is estimated that 83 and 132 million people to the total number of undernourished in the world will be added in 2020. And 3 billion people cannot afford a healthy diet. Now, in indigenous peoples' communities, we often experience the triple burden of malnutrition, where we have undernutrition, when we have micronutrient deficiencies, and where we have simultaneously overweight and obesity. And what happens when these data are collected? Once again, we have lack of data disaggregation. So often we don't know exactly what is the reality in indigenous peoples' communities. What we are learning more and more, and this is also emerging as part of the Food Systems Summit dialogues, is that healthy diets can lead to a reduction of up to 97% indirect and indirect health costs, and 74% in the social cost of green gas emission in 2020. And countries are committed to implement the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition, and we need to ensure that we help to link the dots. So more needs to be done at the country level and at the global level to advocate to link the processes through a multi-sectoral approach. And if we look, for instance, just to give a couple of countries who are committing to the UN Decade of Action on Nutrition, Brazil and Ecuador. And we know very well also that a lot of experiences are emerging in these countries on traditional foods, on healthy diets, and on agroecology approaches in indigenous peoples' communities. And the guiding principle of the action on nutrition are very much in line also with what indigenous peoples wish to achieve. It is country-owned, it builds on existing efforts, it supports all countries to address all forms and causes of malnutrition, and it also provides an inclusive umbrella for all stakeholders. And also the action areas, just to mention one, sustainable, resilient food system for healthy diets. I mean, indigenous peoples should be at the core of these efforts. So let me just give, and I know my time is over, but just to give an important message here. Now, the United Nations system has created one UN nutrition body. It's a reform to improve the UN coordination and efficiency and effectiveness. And this is hosted at FAO and supported by FAO, WHO, IFAD, UNICEF, and World Food Programme. And the UNU reports to ECOSOC. So now you understand, and they have also the country anchors there. So now you understand how important already the system in place for indigenous peoples in the UN need to link with this action through the UN Permanent Forum, through the interagency support group, and through the UN country teams. And there is a new trend on traditional food and healthy foods. IFAD and Biodiversity International have worked a lot on neglected and underutilized species. And we will also launch the guidance on value chains for this traditional food. And we also need to create partnerships with entities like Slow Food, with the Presidia, and finance those initiatives like the Indigenous Peoples Assistance Facility at IFAD. The meeting before this showed the examples and the good practices that are coming out from Indigenous youth who are building on the experience and knowledge of the elders. So my message here is that we do not have to reinvent the wheel. We have system in place. We need to really join hands and link the dots with all the organizations that are there, and to continue and enhance the efforts within the UN, outside the UN, and building the alliances with indigenous peoples, and thinking in the holistic way and the multi-sectoral approach that indigenous peoples has helped us to link. Thank you very much. Over.
Thank you very much, Antonella, for these very inspiring words. I know what we are behind with schedule, and I could see it as well, but in our chat we have a number of questions asked to our panel speakers, and I would invite to continue exchanging ideas even behind and then chatting together in other areas. But just to conclude our session, I take back a few ideas, but it's really very strongly presented today. But there are a number of social changes that we are going around the world, and of course COVID-19 is one of the global challenges that we face today, but there are many other ones which have to be as well taken into consideration, and especially making sure that food is sustainable and provided to everyone, and adaptation processes which take place. We have as well not to damage our intergenerational transmission of language, especially when communities move from one area, let's say more rural to urban areas, and settling down, bringing together the children, and actually losing certain ties with local communities that we come from. And we have heard as well that there are strategies in place which could be adopted, but there is no need in most of the cases to reinvent the wheel. There are structures in place, practices, guidelines, and mechanisms which have to be used. And I would say many of you highlighted what youth is our future. And we are those who represent many opportunities, but at the same time, we have to make sure that we are connected to the older population, that we preserve the languages, the traditions, and technological advantages which are provided to them. We have to be as well provided in local languages, indigenous languages, in order to make a best use of technological development. One thing what I bring as well nicely, what there is a lot of knowledge around, a lot of knowledge in indigenous communities, and the modern science is not able to capture. And we have to make sure that we continue preservation of languages, usage of language in different domains, including agricultural industries. And existing structures like Global Hub is one of the opportunities for all of us to work together. One of the objectives why UNESCO as well organized this panel is that we are in the process of designing a global action plan for International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And clearly food sustainability and language connection exists very strongly, and we have heard from many different speakers today. So I would just invite everybody who is interested to continue working with us. Please contact us, do not hesitate. And there is a time, which is a good timing to actually to contribute to the development of the action plan. So I thank you everyone, and all panel speakers. You were really brilliant, inspiring, and thank you very much, you and colleagues, and everybody who was present today. So let's continue working together, and we'll see each other in our different